What happens to our collective psyche when we remove the guardrails of truth? As a psychologist, I've observed how unfiltered social spaces can trigger our shadow selves. These are the parts of us that Carl Jung, the founding psychoanalyst of analytical psychology, warned could emerge when social constraints disappear. Hello, I'm Dr. RB, a licensed psychologist in Florida and New York. If you've been to my channel, welcome back. And if you're new here on this channel, I bridge together many topics that I find interesting, from depth psychology and ancient wisdom traditions to spirituality, human design, and various psychotherapeutic techniques. All of this is to create a unique approach to healing and growth. My mission is simply to help you connect deeply with your authentic self and divine guidance while navigating our rapidly changing world. Meta, the parent company of Facebook, made a recent decision to end third-party fact-checking, as well as allowing users to express themselves freely with little controls. So we're going to talk about that and go a little bit deeper. So first of all, this decision has really created what in psychology we call a verification vacuum. And this is a space where we have cognitive biases that can run unchecked. So for example, you might have a really strong belief that something is true, and then you check it, you verify it, and you realize that it's not true. And you're like, wow, I really swore that was true. Has it ever happened to you? Well, it happens a lot. And this is what we call a cognitive biases. We really believe it, and we buy into this idea that it is a fact. Also, a lot of times, it's hard for us nowadays to know that there's a difference between something factual and something that's just an opinion. I remember in school early on, and maybe elementary school, they used to teach kids what is factual and what is opinions. And you would go through these exercises where you would put, F for fact and O for opinion. And I'm finding more and more that it's hard for many people to see the difference between what is fact and what is just an opinion. And a lot of the times we see it in the news. We see that they bring in a round table. Most of the time, they're just fellow reporters, fellow anchors or reporters. And sometimes they have reported on a specific subject for a number of years to call themselves an expert, but really they are not experts in the field that they bring in. It's just fellow reporters, and they sit around and they kind of go through a piece of news. A lot of the times we think that they are speaking facts, but they're not. They're speaking their own perspective, their own opinions. And I find more and more that it's hard for people to know the difference. So this shift, it doesn't change how information flows necessarily. It fundamentally, though, alters the psychological safety of these spaces, whether they're communal spaces out in the community or whether they're digital spaces. In this case, we're going to talk about more digital spaces as it relates to Meta's new decision. So from a psychological perspective, this decision taps into what we call a collective regression. And I'm going to explain that too. This is where a group abandons mature defense mechanisms in favor for more primitive ones. And we're really seeing a shift in what Erik Erikson, which is a psychoanalyst, he called it going from basic truth, or basic trust, I should say, to basic mistrust in our information ecosystem. So let me give you an example about that. And I'm going to bring in my mother. My mother has a saying in Spanish that when you leave your house, you need to have the knife between your teeth. And this is a translation. Basically, what she's saying is we have to be ready for battle whenever we leave the house. And she has been saying this for quite some time. And at first, I really didn't give it much thought, but as I did a little bit of research into this topic to present to you, I realized that in society we have become more aggressive, like waiting for an attack to happen. And I'm gonna give another example of an experience that just happened to me recently. I went to Miami for the holidays to spend the holidays with my family. And as I was picking up the rental car at the airport, the agent behind the desk, there was nobody there, which was ironic because this was on the 16th of December. So I already figured I'm getting close to Christmas. So I thought there was going to be a lot more people, but there wasn't. And, I'm not going to get into why that is. It was just a way that they were conducting, telling people where to go. So anyway, there was nobody there. I had prepaid the rental car with my points from my credit card, but for some reason in the system of the rental car, they could see that I had prepaid it, but they didn't know how much. And I didn't think that was a big deal to know how much. I just thought it was enough for them to know that I had prepaid the car, but no, they needed to know how much I had prepaid. And since that was not included, they could not release the car, which I've never heard such a thing, but that's how it went. So I had to call my credit card and speak to the person in charge of, points and all of that. And basically, after an hour and a half of going back and forth, I had to pay for the car, even though I prepaid. I had to pay for the card and then expect to get reimbursed later on after I had returned the vehicle, and I was going to be there for 2 weeks. So obviously I was not happy about this, but my point is that all I did, I was in a good mood. I was excited to see my family. All I did was lean over and ask the agent, who happened to be also a supervisor. I just said, "Can you show me where it says that?" He was explaining some policy to me. And all I did was ask him to show me. And immediately he began yelling at me and he said, "Look, I'm just trying to help you out." And he was very loud. And then I was really shocked and surprised by his reaction. And I just leaned over in my very low voice. And this is now I'm being a psychologist here. So I put my little psychologist hat on with a very low voice to kind of de-escalate the situation. And I said, "I'm just asking you a question." And then I saw that he calmed down. He brought it down. But my point here is this has a lot to do with basic trust to basic mistrust. When you are expecting in society to run into people that you assume are going to be nice to you, they're going to respect you, and there's going to be basic etiquette in the community when you leave your house, then, you're relaxed and you're not expecting to go into battle. But when you leave your house and you have a knife between your teeth, as my mom likes to say in Spanish, that already sets up this flight, fight, and a freeze anxiety mode when you leave your house because you're expecting to go into a battle zone. You're expecting people to be nasty to you. You're expecting to get into arguments with people. It's not very nice. And what's going to happen over time is you're not going to want to leave your house. And that's going to increase isolation. That's going to increase probably depressive symptoms. So it really creates an unsafe environment. So let's move on. So let me break down the psychological implications of how I see as a psychologist Meta's decision here. The first thing that I see that's going to be an increase is what we call cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is when you use whatever justification to justify something that you know is not good or you made a bad decision. It's usually when people buy something and they spend a lot of money and they want to justify it. That's an example of cognitive dissonance. But when users encounter conflicting information in social media and they're not able to verify because there's no fact checking, it really creates an internal tension that often leads to what we call belief perseverance. And belief perseverance is when you are really clutching tighter to existing beliefs, even though there's contrary evidence. And this is where we get into this whole idea of distrusting scientists, distrusting people that, have spent years studying a certain topic, and you start to distrust everything that is part of what you think are the elites. And the elites are just simply people that have specialized in certain information and they're experts in their field. But so when you get rid of them because you really want to make this belief that you have real and true, this is part of this belief perseverance. And this is something that we have seen definitely in the last decade, if not even a little bit before, but it's really come out in the last decade. Then we have something that's called group polarization. And this is where in Meta, they were talking about this idea of community notes, and community notes can amplify what social psychologists also call group polarization. So they basically said, we're not going to pay for a third-party fact checker. We trust our users to use community notes so that they can decide what is true and not true. They can decide. So how I look at that, when I heard that, the first thing that came to my head was purely economic. So I said to myself, okay, they don't want to pay a third party. They want to save that money, but yet they want the users to do the work for free. So they want everyone that is part of Facebook, the Facebook users, the Facebook community, to do this fact checking for free and use the community notes. So just think about that. I mean, we have enough going on to do, free work. I do pro bono work, but I know I pick and choose what I want to do for free, right? I don't want to have to do it for social media. So this is what brings about this group polarization. And this is where like-minded individuals reinforce each other's beliefs, even though those beliefs could be wrong, and they end up creating more and more energy around it and creating more of an extremist view. Okay. This is what we call echo chambers because everybody's believing the same thing. No one's telling you anything different. And even if somebody did research, put it on the community notes, there's probably more people that are believing something that has not been proven true, and they'll just steamroll over any person bringing up some facts. And we see that even with a fact checker, but it's going to get worse without one. So the other thing is we have something called diffusion responsibility. And again, this is tied to the community node. And this is really related to social psychologists Latané and Darley. They identify this as bystander effect, a bystander effect. And basically the idea is if there's an emergency, let's say somebody gets run over by a car and they're just laying in the sidewalk, the more bystanders that surround this individual, the less anything gets done. And that's because everyone believes that somebody watching this will do something. So while they're all waiting for one of them to take action, action doesn't happen. And this is the same thing with the community notes. So consider how this affects then our collective shadow. Collective shadow is what Carl Jung identifies as the parts of ourselves that repress impulses. So when a platform removes professional fact checking, they're essentially removing what we call ego boundaries in group dynamics. So again, this is basically like letting all the reins go and letting everyone say whatever they want to say and believe whatever they want to say, or even push it as if it were true. And then it becomes very confusing of what is true and what is not true. And I also want to add here that this creates a lot of what I call fact checking fatigue, because there's so much out there and we don't have time to fact check everything that we just, slowly become more and more tired. And as we're tired, we tend to accept anything. So that's another thing that is possible to happen. So as a psychologist, I'm particularly concerned about some patterns that are archetypal. And when I say archetypal patterns, I'm referring to psychological patterns that go across cultures and go across gender. I mean, it's basically part of our human makeup. And one of the things that could easily arise here is the trickster archetype. The trickster archetype has a lot to do with business. It has a lot to do with, because the trickster usually rules areas of business and boundaries. And so when you don't have this fact checking or this boundary, then what you have is you have something that is unleashed that's dangerous because it doesn't have a counterbalance of what Jung also called the archetype of the wise elder. And the wise elder would be, for example, the fact checkers. They could be seen as that. So it's like a counterbalance. So people will still say things that are not true, but yet by having a fact checker, you could balance that out. By not having it, you don't have any counterbalance to whatever comes up. Then there's also the other issue of allowing freedom to express oneself without holding back. This is the second thing that Meta brought forth. So they're not only getting rid of the fact checker, they're also getting rid of any boundaries or any limits. So whatever you want to say is unchecked, and the exposure can just, you go all out there and say whatever you want to say in the name of freedom of speech. But whenever you do that, things can get really crazy. And I really don't like using that word as a psychologist, but it becomes unhinged. So it's just picture, your children. I remember that, and I might get in trouble for this. My little sister, when we were little, she did not hold back on whatever she said. And so we had a family friend come over and he had a mole right next to his nose. And I remember my sister used to always come up to him and say, "Clean your nose. You have a big black booger next to your nose." And we were all embarrassed. It happened every time this man came over. And so this is an example of that. But of course, it's much worse. And a lot of us have experienced hate speech. And then the more we experience hate speech, we start to feel like we don't have anyone looking after us. We don't have any protection. We start to feel powerless. And this is where we start to realize that the more powerless we feel to combat the negativity, this then starts to lead to feeling more stress, which of course, stress has to do with higher cortisol levels. We also have the activation of a threat response. And this is where I talk about, the anxiety, where you fight, you flight, or you freeze. You also have the development of avoidance behaviors, like I mentioned earlier. If you keep thinking you have to have a knife between your teeth when you leave your house, you start not to leave your house. And I think that's one of the things that maybe happened during COVID is that people began to feel safe in their homes, and they felt so safe and so good that when COVID ended and you had to go back into the community, there was this heightened sense of hostility out there or negativity out there that you began to retreat back into your home. And so I really think that this is something that has increased after the pandemic, and now we see happening here. Another thing that's very interesting is before I even thought of doing this video on this topic, even on LinkedIn, there was a lot of people writing about psychological safety, especially in companies. And this all began to happen after companies, not all of them, thank God, but a lot of companies began to do away with their DE, which is the diversity, equity, and inclusion departments, or even policies, or even in the values. So as soon as they started to get rid of them, the psychological safety began to diminish. People felt unsafe to show themselves. Even now, I have to even admit that in this age, that this new age of possible, DJT taking the throne, I've had to think twice about the types of questions I will answer when I'm asked about my sexuality, when I'm asked about even my marital status, my ethnicity. I'm very careful on how I answer that, if I answer it at all, because I just don't feel safe. So again, this is not just about misinformation. It's also about psychological safety and the collective mental health. So when we remove structured fact checking, we're essentially removing this, what Winnicott, another object relations psychoanalyst, what he called the holding environment. And that psychological space is where people feel safe enough to explore and grow. So, as both a clinician and a human being, I've observed how unregulated community spaces, especially digital spaces, can trigger what we call social threat response. And this is really activating our primary brain's fight, flight, freeze response that I've already mentioned. And this constant activation can lead to what we term digital trauma, which is a new term lately. It's cumulative psychological harm from repeated exposure to unregulated online spaces. Now, those of us that are older, I have to say, who grew up in the world before social media, I think have fared a little bit better than those that all they know is this world of social media. And that's because social media represents a community, right? And so if you don't feel safe in your digital community, a lot of the times the digital community is even more closer psychologically and emotionally to you than real people. So when you don't feel safe in that digital community space, you're going to feel shunned and you're going to feel like you can't survive in the world. So it's very similar to in the colonies or even in the medieval times where people were actually kicked out of the community or kicked out of the city or town. They didn't make it. Very similar to that. And so that's pretty much what I wanted to express. And this is particularly my reason for making a very difficult decision to leave Meta and the Meta platforms. And because, the way I see it, again, bringing in the economics of it, these are platforms that benefit financially from its users. So Meta benefits financially from me using the platform. And because I've also invested in advertising for my private practice and my small business, they also benefit even more because I'm actually advertising on their platforms. But now when I see someone making these blanket policies that go against my own values, my values that include psychological safety, my values that include, promoting what is true and factual, then I have to really consider, should I continue investing and partnering with these platforms that go against what I believe in? And, it's only going to be a matter of time where I'll start to experience hate speech. I'll start to experience people even making up things. I mean, and, under these new policies, people can make up anything they want about you. And this can really have a professional negative impact. This can have an economic impact. And so before we even get there, I've made the decision to leave these platforms. And this is not going to be an easy task because I've had to really look at how dependent I am on them. And this is reminding me on how Europe had to really look at their dependency on natural gas from Russia before, cutting ranks with Russia. And so it's very similar to, just of course, on a much smaller scale, I've had to make those decisions. So if you are also dealing with the negative impacts, if you are experiencing anxiety, depression, or trauma from online experiences, and if you're also struggling with the decisions to leave Meta platforms, then I invite you to explore those feelings on here or in a therapeutic setting. If you want to schedule a consultation where we can discuss your digital well being, you can visit my website, which I'll have the link below, as well as the link to schedule a free 15-minute consultation to see if we're a good fit to work together. I specialize with these types of issues, if you will. And together we can really work on establishing healthy boundaries and protecting your psychological safety in an increasingly and unregulated digital world. If you like this content, I encourage you to please subscribe, ring the bell so that you don't miss any of these episodes, and leave your comment below. Thank you for watching.